Live from SABC studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, welcome to this evening's episode of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko and thank you for tuning in. A buoyed President Cyril Ramaphosa, together with the country's biggest leaders, hails the investment conference held today in Johannesburg. Says it was a huge success. We bring you the details.
With the pledges we have received today, and with the cancellations and additions we have heard about from investors in previous conferences, we've now taken the total level of investment pledge at the fourth investment conference to 1.14 trillion rand.
And it's been hailed as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, milestones so far this year, exceeding expectations by raising a whopping 14 billion rands for the fiscus. But will the much talked about spectrum really live up to the hype and deliver on such areas as education, health, policing, data, to name but a few? Our panelists discuss all that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts now. President Cyril Ramaphosa says his investment conference held today in Johannesburg has netted 332 billion rands in investment. With over 1 trillion rands raised since the investment conference was started 4 years ago, Ramaphosa says today's pledges can only mean that the ambitious 5-year target of 1.2 trillion rands will certainly be exceeded next year. Here's the president over an hour ago taking stock of what he says has been achieved.
4 years ago, we set ourselves an ambitious target of raising 1.3 trillion rand, 1.2 trillion rand rather, over a 5-year period. The 80 investment pledges at today's conference come to a total of 332 billion rand. That was announced today. Now, if you are like me and you add up sums very quickly, with the pledges we have received today, and with the cancellations and additions we have heard about from investors in previous conferences, we've now taken the total level of investment pledge at the fourth investment conference to 1.14 trillion rand. Now, with just 1 year left to go, we have now reached 95% of the ambitious target that we set 4 years ago. What this means is that we now only have 60 billion rand short of our target to hit 1.2 trillion rand. Is that not a great achievement already? Now, I'm not a soothsayer or a magician or a prophet. I expect that by next year we will not only reach our target, but we are going to exceed that target of 1.2 trillion rand. The investment commitments that have been made here today are most impressive. They're impressive not only by virtue of their cumulative value of the investments themselves, but also by the sheer number and diversity of projects that they represent.
Earlier in the day, after delivering his keynote address at the conference, as well as meeting some of the investors who were to later make those pledges he spoke about, our political editor, Mzwandile Mbeje, sat down with the president.
As the conference to woo investors kicked off, some were crying foul over the loss of their jobs, something the president said his administration is working hard to overcome.
Of course, the workers at Clover, they have a dispute with their employer, and there will always be disputes. with employers and employees, and we have a fairly sophisticated and a very mature labor legislation dispensation that deals with that. And the reason we put those laws in place is because we anticipated that there will be disputes like retrenchments and dismissals.
770 billion rand has been pledged since the investment conference started 4 years ago. The target is 1.2 trillion rand in 5 years. Huge infrastructure backlog, corruption and fraud have led to the stalling of several projects in some areas.
Well, that's a problem that I have identified. I've articulated it, and corruption has been one of the key problems. We are dealing and tackling corruption and deploying people who are not capable of executing the task. We are dealing with that as well, and getting projects off the ground and making sure that they happen is precisely what we are dealing with. Now, obviously, we all want all these things to be done in one day, but it takes time. It takes time. The important thing is that we have identified the challenges. We now can pinpoint exactly where the problems are.
With the conflict in Ukraine leading to the increase in oil prices, South Africans are already feeling the pinch, and the food prices look set to go up.
So all that is going to be under great stress, and it's going to be challenged, and the price of fuel is going to go up, price of food is going to go up, and we are looking at that at government level to see what the impact is going to be, how negative it is, and how we can address and mitigate whatever negative impact might be.
It's a year away from his stated target of 1.2 trillion rand in 5 years. 2/3 of this has already been achieved. Whether the target will be met in a year's time, only time will tell. Mzondile Mbeje, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, let's take you live to Sandton now, where people attending the South Africa Investment Conference are now sitting back, relaxing, and having some dinner. Kaile Kumalo, it's been a long day for you and the rest of the colleagues who have been there since the early hours of this morning. Besides, I wouldn't like you to miss out on that stately dinner and mingling with business and political leaders, diplomats. But watching earlier as groups of investors who had made pledges were being announced, there was a notable absence of investors putting money in sectors that actually desperately need a revival right now. And tourism is one such sector. And earlier, I understand you spoke to the tourism minister.
Well, that's right, Vuyo. So the Tourism Minister, Lindiwe Sisulu, was very clear about some of the challenges that are besetting the sector, especially because we know that with COVID-19, a lot of tourists were not able to come to South Africa. But also, apart from that, the issue around the visa regime in South Africa, that has been a very key impediment. But a very central issue has to do with crime in South Africa. Some investors really told the minister when she had to go to Dubai on the charm offensive really to try and get investment into South Africa. So once again, that was a very key message. In fact, one of her counterpart, Minister Patel, once again was talking about some of the challenges that the investors were talking about in South Africa, the issue of provision of services and energy. But Vuyo, let's take a listen to what Minister Sisulu had to say.
What is required of us is that we must adhere to the requirements of that particular country. With us, we've been working very hard, especially the tourism industry, to persuade government and the various government departments that are involved to remove the PCR test and leave the vaccination, or have the PCR test and remove the vaccination. But what won the day is that vaccination is necessary. That is what the WHO requires of all of us. So we have left that in place, but we have dropped the PCR. So anybody who's vaccinated is free to come to our country. We want them to come to our country. Our doors are open for them to come to our country. It is the best country in Africa, in the world. Its people, its the weather, it's just about the best place to be when you want to recover. So we would like to invite anybody, all the holiday makers that are looking for a spot to come to, try South Africa. You'll get the best of everything.
Now, Kaya, I mean, there's often, we're told, a direct link between foreign direct investment and a country's policies. And right now, South Africa is being criticized in some quarters for its stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I saw our international relations minister taking a front seat this morning, and later on, our foreign editor, Sophie Mukwena, asked President Ramaphosa about this, and he didn't seem to be too concerned. What are you hearing from the diplomatic community there?
Well, that's right, Vuyo. So that issue really has been an albatross really in South Africa's neck. A lot of people have really just been questioning South Africa's stance in as far as that conflict is concerned in Ukraine. What has been the stance of South Africa is the issue of the calling for the constructive dialogue amongst the warring parties. That, of course, the Russian Federation alongside Ukraine. So I got an opportunity to speak to the French ambassador here in South Africa. So he stated in no uncertain terms that the French companies really, they do believe that South Africa still remains as a very key investment ground, but also made it very clear that this war, the geopolitical tension that you're seeing in Eastern Europe, undoubtedly will affect us here in South Africa. Also talking about the rise in terms of the food and many other supplies as well, but also most importantly emphasizing that over 50 billion rand will be invested by the French companies, but of course repeating that call that the cessation of hostilities is absolutely critical at this point. So let's take a listen to what you had to say.
More companies want to invest in the country. We have very strong and old partnerships between South African companies and French companies. And today it's quite historical because 3 years ago we pledged 20 billion rands in investment for the next years, and we already met actually this objective. And now we just announced in front of President Ramaphosa a new commitment of 50 billion rands for the coming years. So it shows that French companies are really willing to keep investing not only in capital but also in human and people, because that's really what makes a difference at the end of the day. So in spite of all the context, the COVID crisis, the Russian war to Ukraine, we really want to keep investing, and South Africa is a great partner.
Okay, the French ambassador there, Kaya. Now, I mean, I saw later on also, I mean, that briefing that was addressed by the minister responsible for trade, industry and competition, that investors raised a whole host of other issues like, you know, municipalities, water, electricity and other things. But from interviews that were done by you and the rest of the colleagues throughout the day, leaders of business organizations as well as some of the country's big industrial players, CEOs, were waxing lyrical, saying, or in fact sharing the president's sentiment that this investor conference was a big success. Now, economists, though, tend to be a little more skeptical than, you know, organized business and, of course, not needless to say, politicians as well. What is their attitude? Because they tend to be a lot more forthright, you know, in their analysis or in how they see these things.
Well, that's right, Vuyo. So the sentiment is very clear from a number of industry players that you have been speaking to and some experts. So they're very clear that the government really's role is about making sure that the environment is very conducive for job creation, for just making sure that the investors really are able to believe in the mantra that South Africa is a key gateway to South Africa. But of course, at this point in time, we are bringing into this conversation, we're joined by Sihle Mkhize. Of course, he's an economist. So let's get a sense from him from him, just in terms of the very key takeaways that he had. So thank you so much indeed, sir, for your time. So first and foremost, how important is this gathering in terms of making sure that we're able really to attract all these key players into our shows?
Right, thanks for having me. Israel Mkize, by the way, just correct that. Well, the investment community in the past 5 years, or past 5-year economic cycle, they've been looking for places where they can park their capital, because the past 5 years has ushered in a new crop of leaders. In the West, you had Trump, you had Boris in the North, and you had in Ghana a change of leadership, as well as down in the Southern Hemisphere with the president, such as Cyril Ramaphosa. And when you look at all these leaders, what's been common with them is that they have a very strong background with the private sector and are quite familiar with the investment community, which all the time seeks opportunities, not necessarily per se to create employment, but to create more returns on their investment. Number 2, safety for their capital. Number 3, to make sure that the risk returns nexus are consummate to each other, that the capital returns will not really take too much long time to realize the gains in whichever type of market they're investing in, whether it's an emerging market, a developing or a developed market. So when you're going to have investors coming from across the globe to a conference like this, in particular after such a depressing curve caused by the scourge and the pandemic of COVID-19, the lockdowns and so on, there was a lot of holding back from capital allocators just to check and watch the rein and the mood of the market as to, is it safe now to deploy capital again? So when they come out in numbers like this, as we see here in Sandton, it's quite a very beautiful picture.
And just once again, in terms of the impact on the ground,
right,
a lot of South Africans are wondering, where does this fund go to?
Okay.
Especially because, you know, the massive unemployment rate we have in South Africa, almost 46%. Will this really have any substantial impact?
Well, we have to be honest and say, for the past 8 years, the South African economy has been failing to reach the goals that were set in the NDP, National Development Plan, to have an economy that's growing at 6% and to reduce unemployment below a double digit. So already this conversation started 4 years ago, or 5 years ago. This is the 4th offering. It already was at a very negative unemployment space. Okay, so now when you're gonna add the whole bloodbath of jobs and business that was caused by the lockdown, especially the hard lockdowns, you then get a situation where capital has to see how it reinvents itself. As it reinvents itself, obviously by re-stimulating the economy and replanting a lot of capital to run around the economic system. So obviously you then find that the job creation question has to be a big factor. I mean, the government has announced even during the lockdown that they want to do an infrastructure driven sort of recovery, which would be labor intensive. Obviously, when you look at the investments that have been discussed, I mean, the initial target, which was pronounced by President Ramaphosa, was a target of 1.2 trillion. The first leg, which was the 3 encounters, they raised about 774 billion, which was 64%, and in terms of commitments, and about 57 projects were already completed by the 3rd meeting leading up to the 4th one. And now the raising of this 330 billion on this particular conference, it tells you that he has achieved sort of 95%, if not 96%, of his target, probably shy of about 125 billion to achieve the 1.2 trillion. Now, how does that affect the jobs? Obviously, these are, when you listen to the sectors, it was steel producers, windows producers. In the main, it was in the manufacturing. In the main, it was in sectors that usually are labor intensive. So you would then expect, as you were listening, that there was pledges from Limpopo, Gauteng, Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. you'd obviously expect then these companies as a criteria not only to realize profit through using a capital intensive, for instance, realization of the profits, which means using machinery. I would like to believe that the president was very strict to say it has to be a labor intensive, absorb as many workers as possible so that you re-engineer the economy by having a lot of people working so that they can be able to earn and also come back to spend on the economy. Then that safeguards the entire enterprise and value chain ecosystem of the investments, as investors are able to create jobs and therefore able to safeguard their assets in the country.
And just before I let you go, sir, obviously Minister Patel, responsible for trade, industry and competition, stated as well the issue around the disruption in terms of the economy in light of those very unfortunate events during July, the unrest that we saw. In fact, he said there was a cancellation of some projects. What does that mean for the country? For the longest time, South Africa has been lauded as a very strong economy in terms of security in the continent. But for the investors, what do they take away from this?
Well, the economic cycle, whether it's through recessions, technical recessions, or unexpected events, or imbalance in terms of security, or issues that are just radical disruptions, such as we saw the vandalism of the infrastructure, they always happen in economic terms. Obviously, capital is very sensitive, and capital allocators or investors, they are very sensitive. They have to watch as long as the environment seems to be conducive that their investments will bring returns. So what I think will be their takeaway is that, number one, South Africa has shown that it is a country that believes or is rooted in the rule of law. They obviously would want to see what does the government do as a follow-up to either bring to book whomever they feel went out of the norm to raise the frustrations. We must also be honest and say, I mean, you can see that at the highest level of government, there was a big debate whether it was an insurgence or an uprising or whatever. But the bottom line is the environment was very compressed, depressed, and people had lost jobs. The hustlers were by law told to stay at home. So the frustration was boiling. So I would imagine that investors factor those things in as they study the environment to say some of those things that happened, people looting and the vandalism, it was to some extent long effects of hard lockdowns. So now that the country is open and the regulations have been lessened and disaster management have been pushed to a little bit flex, and the economy has started to, I mean, you look at the numbers that have been coming out, you look at what the SABC has been doing in the rates, in the hiking cycle, the stabilization of inflation and so on. So they see that there are very good technical measures, quantitative and qualitative, that the economic cycle is trying to, and the government is trying to put in place to stabilize what we see. Then they feel that, okay, we know South Africa has a long historical output in terms of stabilizing the economy. Maybe they feel that, okay, we can pump our money back to this and it'll have consummate returns.
All right, Israel, thank you so much indeed for that insight. Of course, I got his name right, Israel, not Sisha. So we have quite a lot of issues. It's really a plethora of issues really being explored by the investors. South Africa really trying to really attract as many investors as possible. So it's a charm offensive from the side of South Africa to make sure that, you know, they deal with so many issues from energy, infrastructure development, and many other sectors as well.
Oh, yeah, great deal of positivity. Kailisha, thank you very much for that this evening. Of course, I mean, yeah, it does look, I mean, good. Economists are generally happy. Organized business also happy. The president and his ministers are also happy. But there were people who were not as happy, and those are workers, some of whom were protesting outside the venue today to highlight their grievances. Take a look.
Government says it's also doing its part in reducing its deficit and debt burden.
We are working to steadily reduce our deficit and debt burden. And we are shifting public spending away from consumption and servicing our debt towards supporting capital investment, productive activity, yes, as well as social development.
Meanwhile, outside the investment summit, workers from several unions took to the streets to air their grievances. They handed over a memorandum of demands to the presidency.
We've got to have a conversation about the type of economy that we want, the economy that will work for the great majority of the working class people. And we are saying that what this calls for is the fact that we need to begin to take the key industries into public ownership so that there is a democratic control and management of the economy, of the industry, of our workplaces, so that we take our own destiny into our own hands.
Back inside the summit, President Ramaphosa acknowledged the grievances brought forward by some of the workers who were demonstrating outside.
Now and again, companies run into trouble or whatever trouble, and they need either to shed workers, and sometimes they employ workers. Now here we are dealing with 1.2 trillion rand of investments, which should lead to more people being employed.
State capture and corruption have often crippled government's efforts to rebuild the country and economy. In a bid to reassure investors, Ramaphosa says his administration remains committed to fighting these scourges and to strengthening the capacity of the state. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, hopefully the issues the workers are raising there are in fact receiving attention, if indeed the conversations that were promised are actually taking place. You'll remember that during the State of the Nation address, the President said they were giving themselves, I think, about 100 days within which to negotiate a new social compact between labor, civil society, business and the government. And many of the issues that need to be part of those conversations were in fact the very issues that those protesting workers were raising there outside the venue of the conference. But let's also bring you what President Ramaphosa had to say today about the situation in the Ukraine. Our foreign editor Sophie Mukwena did take him up on that, asking him about what he thought of investor sentiment on the back, of course, of unhappiness that some people or countries have over the country's stance with regard to Ukraine.
South Africa is really pushing to ensure that we have these international investors as well. But it comes at a very critical time, the war in Ukraine and the wrangling among world leaders. Your message to the world leaders ahead of the EU summit, NATO and G7, your message?
Well, my message is what I've been saying, that as South Africans, we strongly believe that conflicts should be resolved through mediation, engagement, negotiation. We've found that that is the best process or method of resolving conflicts, and being able to engage and get parties to genuinely get involved in negotiation. I can't see any other way through which a conflict such as the one we've got in Ukraine and Russia can be resolved. So my message to them is find time, find space, and commit effort and everything else to get down to negotiating with the parties that are involved in that conflict.
Well, from what we've told you during the past half hour, you can, of course, get in touch with us via Twitter and tell us what you think, whether you think or you're as optimistic as the president, organized business and other people are about this particular summit. They have met the target. 95% of the target the government set for itself has now been met. They are short of about something like 60 billion or thereabouts, and the president being confident that they are going to meet their target come next year? What do you think do right to us? After the break, we look at investment South African telecommunications companies have made in the run-up to today's investor conference, and whether it's going to be the spectrum, the allocation of the spectrum, that is going to be the game changer that people say it has the potential to be, and whether indeed South African communities, especially the poor, are indeed going to benefit. That's coming up in the next short while. Well, it's been hailed as one of the biggest, if not the biggest milestone so far this year, exceeding expectations by raising a whopping 14.4 billion rands for the fiscus. But will the much talked about spectrum really live up to the hype and deliver, especially on such areas as education, health, policing, and so on? Well, our panelists discuss this, and I'm joined on the line by people who have been active in this space, wanting to get more information, but also making their own assessments of whether indeed the claims that are being made are going to be or stand a chance of being honored. Buntu Kabastole is the founder and director of Graphene Dynamic and Bequest. Hassan Logat is the national spokesperson of the People's Media Consortium, and we hope to be joined in a short while by Michael Graf, who is an activist and communication organizer for the Right to Know campaign. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. My sincere apologies about yesterday. This conversation was supposed to have last night. But just what you make, I don't think anyone would argue the fact that, 14.4 billion rands to the fiscus will go a long way towards attending to some of the things, of the needs of the country. But from your research, from your conversations, when you've been asking questions throughout this period, do you get a sense, that, these players, these people who have spent so much money, during these auctions, will indeed honor the commitment, the promise that we've been told about? Hassan?
Yeah, I follow the dictum, nothing is given without a demand. I think if we leave these corporations to their own devices, they'll continue profiteering because, basically who won out? It's the duopoly, MTN and Vodacom. The president's brother-in-law, Rain, and Telkom got the scraps, the other bit. But 2/3 of what was won by the duopoly. If you look at the terms of reference of this Gazette of October 2020, which set in motion this auction, they promised they would adhere to constitutional values, promote broad-based economic empowerment. They'll talk about provision of universal electronic communications, connectivity for all, right? They talk about the interests of the consumers, price equality, the developing SMMEs, clearly making the sector more competitive. Now, a few years ago, 2019, the Competition Commission got involved after pressure from community groups like Right to Know and citizens who were really worried that these two companies, this duopoly, were basically having a deal among themselves. The Financial Mail said in 1994, they met in London and made some agreement. They tried to deny it. But in effect, the Competition Commission confirmed they were operating as a duopoly. What does the results show? They won 2/3 of this. They are a duopoly. And they had to be taken to the Competition Commission, and there was some agreement to reduce the prices to make it more competitive because poor people were paying more. We in South Africa were paying more than people in Nigeria, in DRC and elsewhere. And these are the issues that they took up in the Competition Commission. So for me, I think these guys left on their own devices without any clear compact what they should deliver to the poor means that they will continue to profit and prices will come down only if we put pressure on them. I also feel sad that our government did not put in a public authority there, some utility service that can make sure that if these guys don't deliver, we will. But leaving it in the hands of corporations, leaving it in the hands of oligarchs is a problem.
Buntu, from your vantage point?
So I'd like to just introduce my companies. So I run Bequest, which actually builds and trains Wi-Fi community networks in rural and underprivileged townships. We've worked in areas like Kailicha and in the Eastern Cape with popular community networks. And the other company is Graphene Dynamic, where we research and solve graphene domain boundary problems that will catapult the world into the fourth industrial revolution and solve global warming. So my give is that the WOAN, which is the wireless open access network that was.
Hi, Buntu. Hi, Buntu, can you hear me? Okay, we seem to have a problem with Ubuntu's line as well as Michael's. Let me come back to you, Hassan. Is it not?
Hello?
I mean, you were talking about, you know, that how these corporates, you know, work and how they are a duopoly and so on. But is it not in the, how they got, I mean, the bulk of, you know, of what was available? But is that not in the nature? I mean, auctions by their nature, it's the highest bidder who can, you know, who then sets the, you know, I mean, the person able to spend more is the one who actually gets the item at the end of the day.
Listen, then why is the principle, the guiding principle there, that they will promote competition, right? Why is it there, right? How is it that they will talk about developing SMMEs? Now, I'm saying to you, these words are lofty, but the practice has another meaning to it. I mean, it is not us, the poor people, who screwed Nkosana Makate, right, from his please call me. It is the big guys. And there's a small business guy, instead of settling with him, they drag the thing out in court. This is the nature of these guys. Without pressure, without the ability of Makate to take it to the Constitutional Court, to the High Court, he would not have got the reward that he had. But why should this guy have waited so long? So what I'm saying, yes, they've got it. The process has got a lot of problems with it. But if you have stated in your last Competitions Commission that you're worried about whether there's enough competition that will bring prices down, and you end up with the same culprits, clearly there's a problem. And this is what we're calling out for, to be genuinely critical. I mean, you know, this issue came about as part of the change of analog to digital, to free up the spectrum, okay? And we told them that there are some people after COVID are poorer than before. To provide these boxes that will connect them on to television, the digital television, doesn't take into consideration the increased poverty of people. I mean, every day, 5.5 million working people, right? They go to work and they cannot get out of poverty. Most of them are in the agricultural sector, 95%. Domestic labor, over 90%. They earn about 4,125. Now, the kind of support the state wants to give for that set of boxes is those who earn less than 3,500. These are the missing middle that we talk about. People have become much more poorer. So I have great sympathy with the workers who are protesting outside. You can get money inside, but you cannot ensure that this trickle down that they believe in will actually reach poor people and jobs. South Africa is the most unequal country in the whole world. Brazil used to have that, right? Today it is us. It doesn't feature in these discussions. It should have been top and center in the discussion there, that we get investment to deal with these problems.
Michael Kraft, welcome, and I'm hoping just the telephone line will hold. A lot of the players or the people who have actually benefited or who have been able to buy throughout this auction say or have been telling us about why the fact that, they've paid more than the 8 billion or so that ICASA thought would get is a good thing that we should all appreciate, number one. But also the fact that, remember, when they started, when ICASA started, there were allocations to smaller players as well, and that should be appreciated. Do you agree with that sentiment?
No, Vuyo, because that increased amount of money that was raised, all of it will be paid by the customers in the next few years in cost of data that we'll be paying for. But in other words, the price of data will not drop as fast or as far as it could have dropped if they hadn't spent so much money. And secondly, to get to the part about the smaller players, the biggest betrayal of smaller players was the abandonment of the WOAN, which stands for Wholesale Open Access Network. This was very sneakily done. First, they announced in November that they were just putting it on hold, and then a few days before the auction, they said they had dropped it. Now, what would have happened if the WOAN had come into being? Then we could have had a lot of new, even smaller operators, even including community networks. So there would have been much more competition, and probably prices would have dropped further than what we're actually going to see.
Buntu, knowing what you know, and know about how these big players operate, what is now on the table, in other words, the state things are in. How do you see us moving forward as a country and addressing, the issues that all three of you, the issues of, universal connectivity, price, that also Michael was talking about now, all these things, competition, everything that we've been told this process would allow for. How do we ensure that, no one is allowed to get away with murder from this point onwards?
Yeah, so what I think is they should have actually not amended the government gazette. So they made two amendments, the ones that Michael Croft is talking about, where they basically allow the main companies, basically your MTNs of the world, your Vodacoms, those guys to actually choose who they give wholesale capacity to and how they use everything. And so what I think the government should do right now is actually take that, there's some unsold spectrum, that 20 megahertz in the 800 IMT spectrum range that is unsold. I think they should give that to the WOAN, or the Wireless Open Access Network that Michael Croft is talking about, and actually allow us to actually build it up on the side and build our own network that can actually compete against these big companies. So by doing that, it means that companies like myself can then go and buy wholesale data, which then we can then turn into our own SIM cards and build our own IoT products or 5G products that would then be manufactured by the communities and make money for the community as well. And that is actually what we are fighting for. We are fighting for a cheap access to wholesale data so that we can build products on top of that spectrum that will help the community actually move into the fourth industrial revolution. So I really do think they should do that.
And from engagements up until now, what has been the attitude of both the regulator and the government?
So, no, we won't include at all. So the requirements were super ridiculous. To just get into there, like you had to be a tier 2 provider. And then to bid or to get in, like to sit with them, you had to have 3 million rands to secure just the bidding position in the room. So clearly the SMMEs weren't supposed to take part in the auctions or the conversations for that matter. So the process was not isotropic at all. It was just them deciding, just as what Hassan said, it was just them deciding that we're going to partner up together and we're going to actually set the prices, and then we're going to open up this thing that's sort of a WOAN but it's not overwhelmed because we can choose who our competitor is, and we can tell that competitor what prices to choose so that we can keep the prices high. Do you get me?
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying that there needs to be separate spectrum for ourselves so that we can actually set our own prices and govern it by ourselves, obviously along with the government and paying rates and all of that. But at least the government by itself can be governed maybe by WAPA, right to know, Ellipsis. Companies like that can govern. They are people. We've done these things before. Zenzeleni Networks, for instance, has done it. I've worked with Zenzeleni Networks. VPU in Kailicha has done it. I've worked with them. So we know how to build a backbone. We know how to be a tier one provider. But we are not getting access to actually build our own so that we can actually lower the prices to a price point where children can actually, either stay at home and actually, or go to university online, so that they don't need to actually go to class and all of those things. And we are actually moving into the fourth industrial revolution, which means that internet is becoming more and more important. So 10 gigs, I'm not sure if it's a day or a month, is not enough. I think it's a month. So 10 gigs is not enough. I use 10 gigs just for studying alone in a day. That's not enough. I know that.
Now, Hassan, I mean, which levers do we, push right now to actually, get the government and the regulator to actually, appreciate that there are loopholes in this, and we're not really going to get what we've been promised.
Yeah, let me start off by saying this. I think that the system is rigged against poor and small business people, right? These guys are in the same league. The chairperson of the portfolio committee is believed to have untold numbers of shares in MTN, MultiChoice, Naspers, etc. Now, this is the guy looking after the process of those who are benefiting. But let me give you an example of what the lack of competition does. And I'm not a capitalist, I'm a socialist, and I'm talking about why, if you have a strong public facility like Buntu's talking about, a utility or community groups or cooperatives trying to deliver, that is a form of competition that we want, but government must protect those small guys. But they're in the same league. If you use the football analogy, DSTV league, right? They are sponsoring the league. And the two big teams, Pirates and Chiefs, are supported by Vodacom. Our football is dead because there's no rivalry. The money is all secured. No fans want to go, etc. And this is part of how competition works. So these guys have actually corrupted the system. And exactly here, that the rules suggest that it will be SMME promotion, small guys, etc. In reality, the duopoly has come back. What we need to do is we need the SABC to remain a vibrant broadcaster, to ask the tough questions as you are doing, right? But I wonder, when your journalists get fired, etc., and things are interfering, why the portfolio committee doesn't call people? When we say that the SABC is losing audience, why does the portfolio committee not call the board to ask them, why are you losing audience? Why are you rushing for the switch off at the end of this month? So the regulatory bodies, which I include the portfolio committee, have been asleep at the wheel, right? The second issue that what we need to do is we raise the issue there must be strong public utility, and Ubuntu and people like that must be supported, right? We'll raise the argument strongly, right? The rush to switch off, right? The televisions, when poor people don't have the money, undermines public debate and community radio and TVs rather, that we're talking about, right? And that people, small guys like Peace, Call Me and others, had to fight. So we will continue to fight to make sure that they listen to us. But at present, it doesn't look like that the script was in favor of redress, was to overcome inequality and poverty. It looks like it's there to reinforce the elites, and that is wrong. There must be a clear program of action from these multinationals who want to tell us, on day so-and-so, we will be doing a fiber layout in Guguletu. Day so-and-so, we're going to this rural area in Kimberley. They must have that program and not just do the elites. They must do 5 in the poor areas, maybe 1 in the rich areas.
Okay, we are going to, by the way, come back to the conversation around digital migration. I thought that we would park that for today because a lot of time was taken by the big story of the day, which was the investment conference. But I want to, Michael, in your concluding remarks, how do we, and I want to ask you a similar question to what I asked Hassan, going forward, what do we need to do now to make sure that an opportunity that still exists in the form of spectrum that is still available, something is done, perhaps along the lines of what Buntu was talking about? How do we now make sure that going forward we get both the regulator and the department to pay attention to this very issue?
Yes, I agree with Buntu. In fact, Buntu was agreeing with me when he said we should insist that the WOAN should be revived, and they should find spectrum for it, and they should also require the big players, the big operators, to share some of their spectrum with it. I know the contracts have been signed already, but the regulator can find a way, I'm sure. Because small operators like community networks, as Ubuntu was describing, they can do so much more than just provide connectivity. They can also respond to local needs in a local way, you know. For instance, one of the networks that we have contact with in Mamaila, in Limpopo, it's in a community where they speak Kelobedu, which is not an official language. They never see or hear their language on TV or radio. But they can use on their own network. They can distribute Kelobedu videos for free because it stays in the local area. So we need policies that encourage small community networks, not just nationwide entities.
And that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much to all three of you. And for certain, two of you will be back. We want to go on to that discussion, digital migration. On digital migration, but also want to explore these issues. We hope to get the ministry and the department, the regulator, to have a proper conversation, because so much has been promised on this about how it's going to be this big game changer and how everyone is going to benefit, not only the people who have spent some billions now, but who, as my guests were saying, stand to benefit a lot more as they cash in on their investment. So we are going to look into these issues further, and hopefully, as I say, we'll be able to get other players onto the conversation as well. Hopefully a round table, proper, taking more than an hour if need be, because the promises that are being made here are big. Think about what they say is going to do for our health services, our policing, our education. But if you listen to our guests, they're saying, well, if you look at the kinds of, things that are being spoken about, that's a pipe dream. And that's our show for this evening. To join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.